My name is Elaine Porter. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as steady, dependable, low maintenance. The kind of person who doesn't demand much space in a room and rarely takes up more than she's given. I've learnt that when people say those things about you, they usually mean something else too. She'll be fine. She doesn't need special consideration. She won't make things uncomfortable by asking questions. And if she's left out, it's probably for a good reason. I work, I live quietly, I pay my bills, and I don't live in extremes. I don't post my life online, I don't announce my struggles, and I don't ask my family for help. That combination has made me easy to misunderstand. Or maybe easier not to look at too closely. This story isn't about a dramatic betrayal or a single explosive argument. It's about something much quieter. Something that happened slowly enough that, for a long time, even I questioned whether it had really happened at all. It's about the year my parents planned a family trip and decided not to invite me. Not because there was a fight, not because I'd done something wrong, but because, as they put it, they were worried I couldn't afford their lifestyle. They said it gently, carefully, almost lovingly. They framed it as concern, as protection, as practicality. And that's what made it so hard to see clearly. This story follows what came after that moment. Not just the exclusion itself, but the pattern it revealed. The role I had quietly been assigned in my own family. The way small dismissals, when left unchallenged, solidify into expectations. And how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become something very different from weakness. There is no revenge here, no shouting match, no scene where someone finally gets what they deserve. That's not how real emotional justice usually works. Most of the time, it unfolds without an audience, without raised voices, and without anyone realizing the moment they crossed a line until it's far too late to step back. I'm telling this story honestly, not to vilify my parents or to cast myself as a victim. I don't believe in flattening people into villains. I believe in patterns, in systems, in the quiet agreements we never remember consenting to. If you've ever been excluded in the name of concern, if you've ever been told something was for your own good, even as it left you standing outside, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was keeping the peace or simply teaching others what they could get away with, then you may recognize parts of yourself in what follows. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at a moment you dismissed as not a big deal and realized later that it changed far more than you expected? To understand why being excluded from that trip mattered, you have to understand who I was to my family long before it happened. I was the reasonable one, not the most successful, not the one with the biggest personality, not the one who caused concern or excitement. I was the one who adapted, the one who adjusted her expectations quietly so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. Growing up, I learned early that attention was a limited resource. My younger brother needed it loudly. He struggled in school, pushed boundaries, demanded reassurance. My older sister attracted it naturally. She was charismatic, expressive, the kind of person people lean toward without realizing it. I fell somewhere in between, and instead of fighting for space, I learned to make myself smaller. Not invisible exactly, useful. I was the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who showed up on time, the one my parents described to others as easy or low maintenance, as if those were fixed personality traits rather than skills I'd practiced for years. When I moved out, no one worried. When I chose a stable career instead of a flashy one, it was met with polite approval. When I didn't ask for help, it confirmed what they already believed, that I didn't need much. And over time, that belief hardened into an assumption. At family gatherings, I was included by default, but not centered. Conversations moved around me rather than toward me. Decisions were announced, not discussed. If something didn't quite work for me, I was expected to adjust. And I usually did. Not because I lacked opinions, but because I understood the unspoken hierarchy. Harmony mattered more than my discomfort. I told myself this was maturity. When my parents talked about money, they spoke in generalities. They never asked directly how I was doing financially. I never volunteered details. My life didn't look extravagant from the outside. No luxury car, no designer clothes, no social media evidence of indulgence. I lived well within my means, by choice, but frugality is often mistaken for limitation. And so a quiet narrative formed around me. Elaine is careful. Elaine doesn't need much. Elaine wouldn't be comfortable with excess. Elaine probably couldn't keep up. No one ever asked if that narrative was true. I noticed it in small ways. The way my parents hesitated before suggesting restaurants, the way they framed invitations with disclaimers, was as if preemptively managing my reaction. "It's a bit pricey," they'd say, watching my face carefully. And I'd smile and say it was fine, because it was. What I didn't realize then was that every reassurance I gave was being filed away as confirmation. I wasn't seen as someone with agency. I was seen as someone to be managed. Still, I didn't resent them. That's important to say. I loved my parents. I understood them as people shaped by their own anxieties and assumptions. I believed good intentions mattered more than precision. So when they spoke about future plans, retirement travel, upgraded experiences, doing things properly this time, I listened with interest, not suspicion. I assumed family meant inclusion unless stated otherwise. What I didn't yet understand was that, in their minds, inclusion had conditions. Unspoken ones, financial one, lifestyle one. Once I had never been invited to negotiate. To them, I was not the daughter who might choose differently. I was the daughter who might struggle quietly if included. And in their attempt to be considerate, they made a decision about me, without me. At the time, I still believed that being adaptable was a virtue that protected relationships. I hadn't yet seen that adaptability, when it's one-sided, teaches people something dangerous. It teaches them you'll accept whatever shape they assign you. I was about to learn that lesson fully. Not through cruelty, not through confrontation, but through a sentence delivered softly, with a smile, under the banner of care. And once you hear a sentence like that, you can never unhear what it reveals. The first time I realized something had shifted, it didn't feel like a wound. It felt like an awkward pause. One of those moments you replay later, not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't sit quite right. We were having dinner at my parents' house. Nothing formal, just a quiet Sunday evening. My sister was there with her husband. My brother joined late, and the conversation drifted the way family conversations do, circling familiar topics before landing somewhere new. That's when my mother mentioned the trip. She said it casually, almost offhand. A resort. Overseas. Something they'd been planning with my sister's family for months. She described the view, the activities, and the pace. Everyone reacted with interest, adding details, asking questions. I listened, smiling, assuming, without thinking, that this was the first time I was hearing about something I would eventually be invited into. Then there was a pause. Not a dramatic one. Just a brief hesitation where my mother glanced at my father and then back at me. She cleared her throat and said, "We didn't want to put you in an uncomfortable position." I remember the exact phrasing because it struck me as oddly formal for a family dinner. She went on quickly, filling the space. "It's become a bit of a higher-end trip. We just didn't want you to feel pressured, financially." No one looked at me directly after that. Not in a deliberate way, more like a collective instinct to keep things smooth. I nodded. I even laughed softly. I said something neutral, something reassuring. "Oh, that makes sense. Don't worry about me." The conversation moved on immediately. That was the first cut. Not because I was excluded. Exclusion on its own can be disappointing but understandable. The cut came from the assumption beneath it that I couldn't decide for myself what I could afford, that my presence required accommodation, that my comfort depended on their preemptive judgment. I told myself they meant well. I told myself this was about logistics, not value. I told myself it wasn't personal. But something in me went quiet after that. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I replayed the moment. Not angrily, carefully, like reviewing footage to understand a detail I'd missed. No one had asked me anything. No one had said, "Would you want to come?" No one had said, "How would you feel about it?" No one had said, "We'd love to have you there." They had simply decided. What made it harder was how gentle it all was. There was no malice to push against, no sharp edge to justify anger, just a concern, soft words, protective language. Exclusion disguised as care is disorienting that way. If you object, you sound ungrateful. If you question it, you seem defensive. And if you accept it quietly, as I did, it becomes evidence that the decision was correct all along. I didn't tell anyone how it felt. Not my friends, not my family. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself. I filed it away under things that happen and went on with my life. But something had changed. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how often similar language appeared. My parents would talk about the trip in front of me, but with qualifiers. They'd say things like, "It's probably not your kind of thing," or "You'd hate how expensive everything is." Each time I smiled, each time I stayed quiet. Each time, a line was being drawn a little more clearly. The cut didn't bleed, it didn't ache, but it marked something. It marked the moment I realized that in my family, my silence wasn't just being respected, it was being used. After that dinner, nothing outwardly changed, and that, in some ways, was the most unsettling part. Life continued with its usual rhythm. Work deadlines, weekend errands, occasional family calls. If I hadn't been paying attention, I could have convinced myself the moment had never happened at all, that it was a misunderstanding, a one-off comment poorly phrased. But subtle shifts have a way of repeating themselves when left unexamined. The trip came up more often, not in a celebratory way, more like background noise, logistics, booking details, small complaints about schedules and costs. My parents didn't hide the conversation from me, but they didn't include me in it either. I was present, but functionally irrelevant. At first, I treated it as temporary. I assumed there would be a follow-up, a check-in, a moment where someone would say, "We should ask Elaine what she thinks." That moment never came. Instead, the framing solidified. My mother would say, "It's just easier this way." My father would add, "We didn't want you stressing about money." They spoke as if they were doing me a favor, and because I didn't challenge that narrative, it became the official version of events. I started noticing how often this pattern showed up in other areas. Decisions about holidays were made before I was consulted. Family plans were arranged around everyone else's preferences with the quiet assumption that I would adapt. If I mentioned an inconvenience, it was met with surprise, as if my comfort hadn't been considered because it was assumed to be flexible. And I allowed it. Not because I didn't feel the sting, but because I had spent years equating emotional maturity with emotional silence. I believed that being understanding meant absorbing discomfort without comment. I told myself this wasn't disrespect. It was efficiency, familiarity, the result of people knowing me well enough to predict my reactions. But prediction, when unchecked, becomes a limitation. There were moments I could have spoken up. Small ones, casual ones. I could have said, I actually would have liked to be asked. I could have said, "I can decide what I can afford." I could have said, "Please don't assume for me." I didn't. Part of me feared making it awkward. Part of me didn't want to seem defensive or materialistic. And part of me still believed that if I stayed reasonable, things would balance out naturally. Instead, they tipped further. My sister began to mirror my parents' language. She'd say things like, "You wouldn't enjoy this anyway," or "It's probably not worth it for you." Not unkindly, almost protectively. And every time I nodded along, I reinforced the story they were telling themselves. What I didn't see then, but understand clearly now, is that respect doesn't erode in one dramatic moment. It erodes through repetition, through small exclusions that go unchallenged, through assumptions that harden into identity. I became the one who's fine with less. And when you're seen that way long enough, people stop imagining you with more agency, more ambition, more choice. There was a strange loneliness in that realization. Not the loneliness of being unloved, but the loneliness of being misunderstood by people who believed they knew you intimately. I wasn't angry yet, I was tired. Tired of adjusting, tired of being preempted, tired of feeling like my presence came with invisible terms and conditions. Still, I said nothing. I convinced myself that naming the pattern would make it bigger than it was. That silence was the adult response, that drawing boundaries over something so minor would be indulgent. But what I was really doing was normalizing a dynamic that didn't serve me. I was teaching them that my exclusion didn't require explanation, that my feelings were optional, that decisions about my life could be made without my input. And once that lesson is learned, people rarely unlearn it on their own. By the time I noticed how deeply the pattern had settled, it had already shaped the way they spoke to me, planned around me, and imagined my future. I hadn't been pushed aside. I had been quietly placed somewhere and left there. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that what was happening wasn't situational. It was structural. I wasn't being excluded because of a single trip, or a misunderstanding about money, or a moment of poor communication. I was being treated according to a role I had been quietly performing for years. The reliable one, the adaptable one, the one who doesn't make things complicated. Once I saw it that way, I couldn't unsee it. I began noticing how often I was placed in supportive positions without being asked. I was the one expected to adjust schedules, the one who could figure something out, the one whose preferences were considered last, if at all. When my parents needed help organizing paperwork, they called me. When something needed researching, comparing, or handling calmly, it came to me. But when it came to experiences, celebrations, indulgences, big moments, I was suddenly someone who needed to be shielded. It wasn't cruelty, it was categorization. They had sorted me into a box labeled capable but limited. And once someone assigns you a box like that, everything you do is interpreted through it. My careful spending became evidence that I couldn't afford more. My calm demeanor became proof that exclusion didn't hurt me. My silence became consent. I realized that I wasn't seen as someone who chose simplicity. I was seen as someone who had no other option. That distinction matters, because choice implies power, limitation implies dependency. The irony was that I was, by every measurable standard, independent. I paid my own way. I had savings, I had options, but none of that fit the story they'd written, so none of it registered. And I had helped write it. I had spent years minimizing myself in small ways, downplaying successes, avoiding conversations about money, brushing off slights, because I thought it kept relationships smooth. What it actually did was make my inner life invisible. There was a moment, sometime after the trip details were finalized, when my mother said, "You're just so easy, Elaine. We never worry about you." She meant it as praise. I heard it as confirmation. They didn't worry about me because they didn't imagine me needing anything. No consideration, not inclusion, not an agency. I wasn't someone whose absence would disrupt the picture. That realization hurt in a way I didn't expect. Not sharply, not dramatically, more like a dull pressure behind the ribs, the kind you carry around because you don't know where to set it down. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What do they actually see when they look at me? The answer wasn't flattering or cruel, it was incomplete. They saw the version of me that made their lives easier, and I had to confront an uncomfortable truth. As long as I kept performing that role, nothing would change. I didn't want to confront them. I didn't want to explain myself or demand understanding. That kind of confrontation had never felt natural to me, and I wasn't interested in forcing a reaction. What I wanted, though I couldn't yet articulate it, was to step out of the role entirely. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitely. The trip itself wasn't the turning point. That would come later. But this was the moment I stopped seeing myself as misunderstood and started seeing myself as strategically underestimated. And that distinction changes everything. Because when you realize people don't see your full range, you have two choices. You can correct them, or you can let them continue while you prepare. I didn't decide anything yet, but for the first time I stopped trying to be easy. I started paying attention instead. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no moment where I finally said what I'd been holding back. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, in my own kitchen, while making coffee. I was standing there, half awake, listening to the familiar sounds, the kettle, the hum of the refrigerator, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. A photo, actually. The kind she sends without thinking. It was a picture of a balcony overlooking the ocean. The caption read, "Your sister found the perfect place. So excited." That was all. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because the image upset me, but because of what it assumed. It assumed I was an observer. It assumed I would be happy to watch this from the outside and offered updates rather than invitations. It was assumed that sharing the experience with me wasn't necessary, as long as they shared it around me. Something in me settled in that moment. Not anger, not sadness. Clarity. I realized that nothing I said in response to that photo would change how I was being positioned. A polite reply would affirm the dynamic. A passive-aggressive one would make me look petty. Silence would be interpreted as indifference. The shift wasn't about what I did next. It was about what I stopped expecting. I stopped waiting for them to see me differently. That sounds small, but it was profound. Because up until then, a part of me had been holding space for correction, for an apology that would arrive once they realized how it felt, for a conversation where I'd finally be understood. Letting go of that expectation was like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I made my coffee, I sat at the table, and for the first time, I asked myself a question that had nothing to do with fairness or family harmony. What do I want my life to look like, without reference to how I am perceived? The answer didn't come all at once, but I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't centered around explaining myself. It wasn't built on the hope of being included. It wasn't dependent on anyone's permission. That day I went to work as usual. I did my job. I spoke to colleagues. I handled problems. Nothing externally marked it as significant. Internally, something had changed direction. I began noticing how often I adjusted my choices based on anticipated reactions. How frequently I filtered myself to maintain a version of me that others found comfortable. And how rarely that effort was reciprocated. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. I didn't feel the urge to confront my parents or my siblings. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want apologies. I understood now that their behavior wasn't about malice. It was about habit. And habits don't dissolve through emotional appeals. They dissolve when the conditions that sustain them disappear. So I made a quiet decision. I would stop offering information that wasn't requested. I would stop cushioning my boundaries with reassurance. I would stop making myself legible in ways that invited assumption, not as punishment, as recalibration. From the outside, nothing changed. I still answered calls. I still visited. I still listened. But internally, I stopped volunteering my inner life for misinterpretation. Silence for the first time wasn't avoidance. It was a choice. I didn't yet know what this choice would lead to. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't preparing a reveal. I was simply reclaiming something I'd given away too easily. The right to define myself without negotiation. And once you take that back, you don't need to announce it. People feel it later. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been soft, reactive, accommodating, shaped by the desire to keep things smooth. Now it was deliberate, contained, observant. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was the point. I still answered my parents' calls. I still showed up for birthdays and holidays. I still listened when they talked about the trip, about plans, about expenses and schedules. But I stopped filling in the gaps for them. When my mother said, "You wouldn't enjoy this kind of place," I didn't reassure her. I didn't laugh it off. I simply nodded and let the sentence land where it belonged. When my sister talked about costs and logistics, I didn't downplay my comfort or explain my choices. I let her assumptions exist without confirmation. This unsettled them in small, almost imperceptible ways. They were used to me smoothing edges, translating discomfort into ease. Without that buffer, their words hung in the air longer. They had to sit with what they were implying. Still, no one addressed it directly. Silence has a way of being misread when people are accustomed to your compliance. My parents interpreted my restraint as agreement. My siblings took it as disinterest. Everyone assumed I was fine, because that was the role they knew. And I let them, not out of spite, out of strategy. I was learning something important in those months. People rarely listen when you correct them verbally, but they pay close attention when your behavior no longer supports their narrative. I began to redirect my energy elsewhere. I focused on my work with renewed precision. I took on projects that required long-term planning and quiet negotiation. I documented everything: decisions, timelines, commitments, not because I anticipated conflict, but because clarity had become a form of self-respect. I also stopped explaining my financial choices. If I booked a trip of my own, I didn't announce it. If I invested in something meaningful, I didn't justify it. I allowed my life to exist without commentary. That was new for me. At family gatherings, I noticed how often people spoke about me rather than to me. Elaine's always been practical. She's not into that kind of thing. These statements were floated without being checked. And each time I felt a quiet steadiness. I no longer needed to interrupt the story they were telling, because I wasn't living inside it anymore. The trip eventually happened. They sent photos. They shared anecdotes. They described the experience in detail, as if including me in the retelling compensated for my absence. I listened politely. I asked questions when appropriate. I didn't reveal how distant it all felt. That distance wasn't resentment. It was detachment. For the first time, I saw my family not as an authority on who I was, but as a group of people operating within a shared set of assumptions I was no longer obligated to maintain. The most surprising part was how quickly my silence was reinterpreted. When I stopped self-deprecating, my calm was read as aloofness. When I stopped over-explaining, my restraint was read as secrecy. When I stopped accommodating, my boundaries were mistaken for withdrawal. They sensed a change, but misidentified its cause. And that misreading gave me space. Space to observe. Space to prepare. Space to decide what mattered enough to address and what didn't. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was simply allowing reality to unfold without interference. There's a particular kind of power in that. When you stop reacting, people reveal themselves more clearly. They show you what they expect from you, what they take for granted, what they assume will always be available. I was watching closely now, not to judge, but to understand. While my family continued to interpret my quiet as passivity, something else was happening. Slowly, methodically, and entirely out of their view. I was preparing, not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for independence in its truest form, the kind that doesn't require recognition to exist. I've always been someone who plans ahead. That hadn't changed. What changed was why I was planning. Before, my preparation was about stability, making sure nothing collapsed if I wasn't there to hold it together. Now, it was about optionality, about ensuring that every major aspect of my life could move without friction, explanation, or permission. I started by reviewing things I had let drift into shared assumptions, family obligations, informal expectations, unspoken dependencies. I noticed how often I was the quiet fallback, the one who handled administrative tasks for my parents, the one who knew where documents were stored, the one who could be relied on to figure it out when something went wrong. None of this had been formalized. That was the problem. So I began documenting. Not in a dramatic way, just creating clarity where there had been confusion. I organized files, I made notes, I updated the records, I ensured that anything I handled could be handled by someone else, if needed. At work, I did the same. I tightened systems, I cross-trained colleagues, I made my role resilient, not indispensable. There's a misconception that power comes from being irreplaceable. In reality, power comes from being able to leave without chaos. I also took a hard look at my finances, not because I was struggling, but because I had allowed others to believe I might be. I reviewed my accounts, my investments, and my long-term plans. I streamlined, I consolidated, I made choices that prioritized flexibility over appearance. I didn't feel the need to prove anything, I just wanted certainty. In the process, I noticed how much of my identity had been shaped by contrast, by being less than, in a family that valued visible markers of success, and how quietly I had internalized that comparison, even when it didn't reflect reality. Letting go of that comparison was liberating. I began traveling on my own. Nothing extravagant, just purposeful. Places I chose because they mattered to me, not because they impressed anyone. I didn't post photos. I didn't share itineraries. I existed without being narrated. My family didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't comment. Their image of me remained static, careful, contained, predictable. That misalignment worked in my favor, because when people believe they understand you completely, they stop paying attention. I also started noticing patterns in how my parents spoke about money, legacy, and future plans. Offhand comments, casual assumptions, things they said because they believed everyone in the room shared the same understanding. They spoke as if certain outcomes were guaranteed, as if certain roles would remain filled, as if proximity and obligation were permanent. I listened. I didn't correct them. I was learning where expectations were strongest and where they were most fragile. None of this felt dramatic. It felt calm. Almost clinical. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was curious. There's a clarity that comes when you stop needing validation, when your actions are no longer shaped by the hope of being seen differently. I realized then that the most significant changes in power dynamics often happen long before anyone notices the effects. They happen in quiet rooms, in spreadsheets and documents, in decisions made without witnesses. My family thought nothing was happening because nothing was being announced. But I was no longer organizing my life around being included. I was organizing it around being free. And when freedom becomes the priority, a lot of things rearrange themselves naturally. I didn't know yet how or when any of this would surface. I wasn't anticipating a moment of reckoning. I just knew that whatever came next, I would not be caught unprepared. The reveal didn't come with a shock or a surge of adrenaline. There was no sudden discovery, no dramatic document pulled from a drawer. It arrived the way most truths do, gradually, and then all at once. I was reviewing paperwork one evening, something I did periodically out of habit. Old files, updated records, notes I'd made over the years. It wasn't a task driven by urgency, just maintenance. The kind of quiet work that rarely feels important until it is. As I cross-checked information, a pattern emerged that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I wasn't just independent. I was structurally separate. My finances, my legal standing, my professional obligations, none of them were entangled with my family in the way I had subconsciously assumed. There were no shared accounts, no dependencies, no obligations that required proximity or ongoing involvement. What remained were expectations. Emotional ones, informal one, the kind that persist only as long as you continue to honor them. And I realized something else. Many of the roles I played were not reciprocal. I contributed time, organization, and reliability. I offered support without fanfare. But when it came to inclusion, consideration, or shared decision-making, those things flowed in one direction. That imbalance wasn't intentional, but it was real. The clarity hit me not as betrayal, but as relief. I had leverage not over them, but over my own life. For years, I had operated as if family dynamics were fixed structures, as if roles once assigned were permanent, as if challenging them required conflict or rupture. What I saw now was simpler. Roles persist because they're maintained, and I was the one maintaining mine. I didn't feel the urge to expose this realization. It wasn't something to announce. It didn't need witnesses. In fact, its strength came from being private. I sat there for a long time, not thinking about what they had done, but about what I had allowed. Not with self-blame, with understanding. I had believed that loyalty required proximity, that care required availability, that love meant staying in position, even when the position no longer fit. Letting go of that belief was like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The trip, once the central emotional reference point, felt distant now, almost irrelevant. It had been a catalyst, not the core issue. The core issue was this. I had been living as if inclusion was something granted to me, rather than something I could choose to step away from. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want to confront them with spreadsheets or explanations. I wasn't interested in proving that I could afford their lifestyle. That was never the point. The point was that my worth, my presence, did not require financial justification, and I no longer needed to be present where I was only conditionally valued. The realization brought with it a surprising calm. Not empowerment in the dramatic sense, just steadiness. I began asking myself different questions. What would it look like to stop being available by default? What obligations were real and which were assumed? What relationships felt mutual and which relied on my silence? These questions didn't demand immediate answers. They guided decisions quietly. I started saying I can't without explanation. I started letting calls go to voicemail. I started choosing how and when I engaged. Nothing exploded, but things shifted. People notice when access changes, even if they don't understand why. The reveal wasn't about discovering a secret. It was about recognizing that I had options, and that I didn't owe anyone continued access to a version of me that no longer existed. I didn't celebrate this realization. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. And clarity, once established, has a way of shaping everything that follows. Clarity eventually asks something of you. It's one thing to understand a dynamic. It's another to decide what you're going to do with that understanding. For a while, I stayed in observation mode, letting the new awareness settle without forcing a conclusion. But there comes a moment where not choosing is still a choice. Mine arrived quietly, during a phone call with my father. He was talking about the future in that abstract way people do when they assume the shape of things won't change. Mentions of holidays, of logistics, of when we all get together. He spoke as if my role was a constant variable, present, available, unexamined. At one point, he said, "You'll handle that part like you always do." It wasn't a request, it was an assumption. And in that moment, I saw the path forward with surprising clarity. I had 3 options. I could confront them, lay everything out, explain how the exclusion had felt, how the assumptions had accumulated, how the role I'd been placed in no longer fit. That path might bring understanding, or it might bring defensiveness, denial, and months of emotional labor. I could continue as I was, maintain the adjusted silence, accept the limited version of inclusion they offered, preserve harmony at the cost of self-erasure. Or I could change my behavior decisively, without announcement, without justification, and allow the consequences to unfold naturally. Only one of those options aligned with who I was becoming. I chose the irreversible one. Not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. I decided to step out of the default role entirely. That didn't mean cutting contact. It meant removing myself from automatic availability. It meant no longer being the unseen infrastructure holding things together. I stopped preemptively solving problems. I stopped managing family logistics. I stopped positioning myself as the reliable constant. When asked directly, I responded clearly, but briefly. I didn't explain my reasoning. I didn't soften my answers. I'm not able to take that on. That won't work for me. I've made other plans. Each time I said it, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Not anger, confusion. They weren't used to this version of me. What I didn't do was justify myself. Justification invites negotiation. Negotiation invites erosion. I wasn't interested in either. This decision felt irreversible because it wasn't about one event or one boundary. It was about changing the foundation on which the relationship rested. I knew that once I stopped fulfilling the role they relied on, they would feel the absence. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, in the small moments where my quiet labor had once filled gaps. I accepted that. I also accepted that they might misinterpret my actions. They might see distance where there was simply autonomy. They might feel hurt. They might feel confused. I couldn't control that. What I could control was whether I continued living in a shape that no longer reflected me. The decision wasn't accompanied by fear or relief. It was accompanied by resolve. I didn't need them to understand right away, or ever. I just needed to act in alignment with the clarity I'd earned. And once that decision was made, the rest was simply execution. After the decision, I didn't feel lighter. I felt steadier. There was no rush to act, no urge to make a statement. What I had chosen required consistency, not intensity, quiet follow-through, not explanation. So I moved in silence. I started with the practical things, the kind that rarely register as emotional, but carry the most weight over time. I adjusted my schedule so it was no longer built around family availability. Weekends became mine again. I traveled when I wanted, rested when I didn't. I stopped rearranging my life to remain accessible. When my parents asked for help with documents or planning, I responded politely, but briefly. Sometimes I declined, sometimes I delayed. I let them feel the friction of handling things themselves, not as punishment, as reality. I noticed how often they'd relied on me without realizing it. How many systems did I quietly support? When those supports were removed, even gently, things didn't collapse, but they slowed. And in that slowing, awareness began to form. I also formalized boundaries that had previously existed only as feelings. I changed how I communicated. No more immediate replies, no more preemptive check-ins. I allowed space to exist without filling it. At work, similar changes were happening. I finalized plans that had been in motion for months, projects that strengthened my position, opportunities that increased my flexibility. I didn't broadcast these moves. There was no need. The fewer people who know, the fewer assumptions they make. I also took care of things I'd postponed out of convenience. Updated beneficiaries, reviewed long-term plans, clarified responsibilities. These weren't dramatic acts. They were acts of alignment. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was at first. People tend not to notice absence immediately. They notice disruption only after it repeats. The first time I said no, it was treated as an exception. The second time was an inconvenience. The third time, as a change. Questions began to surface. My mother asked if everything was okay. I said yes. My sister asked if I was upset about something. I said no. Both answers were true. I wasn't upset. I wasn't unwell. I wasn't withdrawing. I was simply no longer performing. They tried, tentatively, to re-establish the old rhythm. Invitations framed as obligations. Requests softened with familiarity. I responded consistently. Calm, brief, unnegotiable. And because there was no emotional escalation, there was nothing to argue against. Silence, when paired with consistency, is difficult to challenge. There were moments of doubt. Quiet ones. Late at night, when I wondered if I was being too distant. If I were creating unnecessary distance. If this were to lead to misunderstandings I couldn't undo. But each time, I returned to the same truth. Closeness that depends on self-erasure isn't closeness. I wasn't disappearing. I was redefining proximity. The consequences hadn't fully arrived yet. That would come later. For now, there was only the slow recalibration, the subtle rebalancing of expectations. I stayed grounded in my choice. I didn't look for validation. I didn't wait for acknowledgement. I trusted that clarity didn't need an audience. And as I moved forward, quietly and deliberately, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, it would be based on who I actually was, not who they'd assumed me to be. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small ways. Missed details, delayed plans, minor frustrations that no one could quite place. Things that had always run smoothly began to feel less efficient. My parents started calling each other more often, trying to coordinate things I'd once handled quietly. My sister mentioned how complicated planning had become lately. My brother forgot deadlines he used to rely on me to remind him about. None of them said my name in those moments, but I was present in the absence. What surprised me was how quickly the narrative shifted. Instead of acknowledging that I'd stepped back, they framed the change as circumstantial. Everyone was busy. Things were just harder lately. No one connected the dots out loud. That's another thing about quiet roles. They're most visible only when they're gone. There was a family gathering a few months later. Nothing formal, just a casual dinner. I arrived on time, greeted everyone, and took a seat. I didn't take charge of anything. I didn't organize. I didn't anticipate needs. And I watched. The evening felt disjointed. Conversations overlapped. Small logistics, who was bringing what, when things were ready, fell through the cracks. It wasn't a disaster, just noticeably less seamless. My mother looked tired. At one point, she said, almost to herself, "We're just not as organized as we used to be." I said nothing. Later, my sister pulled me aside and asked, carefully, "You've been kind of distant lately. Is everything okay?" Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was uncertain. I met her eyes and said, "I'm doing well." She nodded, clearly unsure what to make of that. They felt the loss before they understood it. And when people feel loss without context, they often interpret it as withdrawal, punishment, or emotional distance. They didn't see it for what it was, a redistribution of energy. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving it away by default. The more consistent I remained, the more the consequences accumulated. Not dramatically, subtly. Plans took longer. Decisions required more discussion. Emotional labor that had once been outsourced quietly returned to the group. There was discomfort in that. I noticed a shift in how they spoke to me. A new attentiveness, a slight caution, as if they were recalibrating their approach without knowing what had triggered the need. They were responding to the absence of something they had never named. And still I didn't explain, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because explanation would have allowed them to reframe the issue as temporary, fixable, or emotional. This wasn't temporary. This was structural. The consequences were doing what words never could, making the invisible visible. And as they began to feel the impact, I remained steady, present, but not compensating, engaged, but not absorbing. For the first time, the dynamic was no longer tilted entirely in one direction. They hadn't lost me. They had lost access to a version of me that no longer existed. There's a moment in every long-standing dynamic when people sense that something has shifted too far to simply be reset. They may not understand it yet, but they feel the tension, the quiet realization that the old shortcuts no longer work. That's when the attempts to fix things begin. For my family, it started subtly. Invitations became more frequent. Check-ins arrived without a clear reason. My mother called just to ask how I was doing, her voice carrying a careful warmth that hadn't been there in a while. They weren't wrong to notice the distance. They were wrong to think it could be bridged by gestures alone. My parents began suggesting plans that included me again. Casual, low-stakes things. Dinners, short trips, offers framed as openness rather than assumption. It might have worked earlier, before clarity, before the decision point. But by then, something fundamental had changed. I no longer measured closeness by inclusion alone. I measured it by the agency. When my mother said, "We should all do something together soon," I didn't rush to agree. I considered whether I wanted to, whether the invitation came with the same assumptions as before. Often I declined. Not coldly, not defensively, simply honestly. I already have plans. That doesn't work for me right now. Each refusal landed heavier than the last. I could sense the confusion growing, the quiet panic beneath the politeness. They were trying to restore a balance without understanding what had caused the imbalance. My sister tried a different approach. She brought up the trip. She said, "We didn't mean to hurt you. You know that, right? We just thought you might feel uncomfortable." It was the closest anyone came to naming the original wound. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said, "I understand what you thought. Not what you did. What did you think?" There was a difference. She waited, as if expecting more. An explanation, a reassurance, a signal that this conversation would repair something. It didn't, because by then, repair wasn't the goal. I wasn't interested in retroactive inclusion or softened narratives. I wasn't looking for them to rewrite the past in gentler language. What I needed, what I had already given myself, was freedom from the role that made such explanations necessary in the first place. They tried, in their own ways, to step closer, but they were stepping toward an old version of me. And that version was no longer available. The hardest part wasn't saying no. It was watching them realize, slowly, that there was no version of the conversation that would restore the dynamic they were used to. No apology that would rewind time. No invitation that would undo the pattern. No reassurance that would put me back in position. They hadn't crossed a single line. They had crossed many small ones. Never noticed. By the time they reached for me differently, I had already moved. Not away from them, but toward myself. And that movement, once made, cannot be reversed. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no tears, no dramatic unveiling of grievances that had been rehearsed in private. It happened in my parents' living room, on an ordinary afternoon, with daylight still filtering through the curtains. My mother had asked if we could talk. I agreed. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around cooling cups of tea. My father was there too, quiet, observant. The atmosphere wasn't tense so much as uncertain, as if they were approaching something fragile without knowing where it might crack. My mother began carefully. "We feel like we've lost you a little," she said. "You're still here, but not in the same way." I nodded. "Not in agreement, in acknowledgement." She continued, choosing her words with care. She spoke about how things felt different, how I seemed more distant, how they weren't sure what they'd done wrong, but they sensed something had changed. I let her finish. Then I spoke calmly without rehearsed emotion. "I haven't gone anywhere," I said. "I've just stopped filling a role that didn't fit me anymore." There it was. No accusation, no catalogue of past moments, just a statement of fact. They looked at me, waiting. So I added gently, "For a long time, decisions were made about me instead of with me. Not out of cruelty, out of assumption. I adapted to that, and eventually, adapting stopped feeling honest." My father shifted slightly, as if preparing to respond, but I continued, not to dominate the conversation, but to finish the thought cleanly. "I don't need explanations or apologies," I said. "I'm not upset. I just don't want to live inside assumptions anymore." There was silence after that. Not defensive silence, processing silence. My mother's eyes softened, but she didn't rush to fix anything. That was new. She asked, "What do you want from us now?" It was an honest question, and I answered honestly. "I want to be asked," I said, "and I want it to be okay if the answer is no. No ultimatums, no conditions, no emotional bargaining. Just clarity." They didn't fully understand. I could see that. Years of habit don't dissolve in one conversation, but they understood enough to realize that this wasn't a phase, and it wasn't punishment. It was a boundary. The conversation ended without resolution, and that was fine. Resolution had never been the point. What mattered was that I didn't shrink. I didn't over-explain. I didn't soften the truth to make it easier to swallow. I spoke as myself, calm, present, unmoved. And in doing so, I left the room with something I hadn't carried in before. Not closure, but integrity. After that conversation, nothing snapped into place. There was no sudden harmony, no dramatic shift in how my family related to me. What changed was quieter and far more durable. I no longer felt the need to monitor myself around them. I didn't scan conversations for moments where I should soften, explain, or adapt. I didn't feel responsible for managing the emotional temperature of the room. If something didn't work for me, I said so. If I wanted to participate, I chose to. If I didn't, I didn't. That simplicity was new. My parents began to ask before assuming. Not always, not perfectly, but enough that I noticed the effort. Sometimes the asking felt tentative, like they were relearning how to approach me without a script. I appreciated that, quietly. My siblings adjusted more slowly. They were used to the old version of me, the one who filled gaps without being asked, who made things easier without needing acknowledgement. Occasionally, they still reached for that version. And occasionally, I reminded them, with calm consistency, that she wasn't available. There was no bitterness in it, just accuracy. What surprised me most was how this shift affected my sense of self beyond my family. I took up more space at work. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more present. I stated preferences. I declined projects that didn't align with my priorities. I stopped confusing reliability with obligation. People adjusted. They always do. I also became more selective about where I invested my energy. I spent more time with people who asked questions rather than made assumptions, who were curious instead of comfortable, who didn't require me to perform a version of myself to remain included. That changed the texture of my life. I didn't feel hardened. I felt clear. The wound that had once been about invisibility wasn't erased, but it was no longer active. It didn't guide my choices or shape my reactions. It simply existed as part of my history, not my identity. I understood now that quiet dominance isn't about control or withholding. It's about alignment, about refusing to be defined by convenience or misinterpretation. I didn't need my family to fully understand my transformation for it to be real. I just needed to live it consistently. Consistently. And I did. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being excluded gently, not pushed away, not rejected outright, just quietly managed in the name of care. For a long time, I believed that because the intention wasn't cruel, the impact didn't count. I told myself that being understanding was the same as being respected, that staying quiet preserved love. What I learned is this. When exclusion is disguised as concern, it teaches you to doubt your own authority over your life. The trip was never really about money or lifestyle. It was about who was allowed to decide where I belonged. And for years, I let that decision be made without me. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to disturb the peace. But peace that requires self-erasure isn't peace. It's a postponement. There was no moment of triumph in stepping out of that role. No apology that fixed everything. No dramatic reversal where someone finally admitted they were wrong. What there was instead was something quieter and far more lasting. Choice. I chose to stop performing a version of myself that made others comfortable at my expense. I chose to let assumptions stand uncorrected until they collapsed under their own weight. I chose consistency over explanation and alignment over approval. And in doing so, I learned that emotional justice doesn't arrive as vindication. It arrives as freedom. Freedom to be present without shrinking. Freedom to be included without condition. Freedom to step away when inclusion is offered too late or on terms that no longer fit. My relationship with my family didn't end. It changed. It became slower, more deliberate, less automatic. And that's okay, because closeness that is chosen feels very different from closeness that is assumed. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Being underestimated is not a flaw. It's a position. You don't have to correct it loudly. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to explain your worth to people who benefit from misunderstanding it. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is step out of the frame and let people notice what's missing. So I'll leave you with a question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been excluded for your own good? And if so, what did it take for you to decide whether staying quiet was protecting the relationship or costing you yourself?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ